To say about all of them. Do you want me to use that? Okay. I'll try to make it as concise as I can. I think the democratic movements are very important, and they will have an impact on the geopolitical balance in the region. The basic system that you've had in place for several decades is Western-backed dictatorships that are functionally, if not rhetorically, pro-Israel. And Egypt has been sort of the keystone in that arrangement for many decades since the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. Egypt has been, and you could see this in the way Israeli leaders lamented the fall of the awful Mubarak regime. They were very upset about it. And despite American revisionism, where now we're supposed to think that America was on the side of the revolution. You had this disgusting scene of Hillary Clinton going to Tahrir Square a few days ago and, almost claiming the revolution, as if we've forgotten that the Americans did all they could to prop up Mubarak and his regime. And then they were ready to sacrifice Mubarak in order to keep the regime with, Omar Suleiman in place. This is because by losing Mubarak, they lost a really important ally for Israel and for American hegemony and imperialism in the region. A democratic Egypt will not necessarily tear up the peace treaty with Israel, but there's nothing in the peace treaty that required Egypt to act as a proxy for all of Israel's most awful policies, from the siege of Gaza, from providing diplomatic cover for Israel's wars in Lebanon in 1982, 1986, 2006, in maintaining internal Palestinian divisions. Egypt played an important role in that, and increasingly in enforcing Israel's policy of keeping out African refugees and migrants by shooting many dozens in Sinai. African migrants coming up from Darfur or other parts of Africa were shot by the Egyptian regime at the behest of Israel. All of these policies will go. Regionally, Egypt was also the linchpin in the American division of the region between so-called moderates and so-called extremists, and the confrontation with Iran, which through American and Egyptian and other propaganda was really given a sectarian tinge of Sunni versus Shia. All of that, hopefully, will go. But it will take time, I think, for Egyptians, first of all, to complete their revolution and to secure it against the American-led counter-revolution, which is ongoing in the region. And not just American-led, but David Cameron was in Cairo a few weeks ago and took the top executives of British arms companies with him. I'm not sure what they have to do with supporting democracy in Egypt. So that's one important element. The other, of course, is these revolutions show potentially, in the best cases in Tunisia and Egypt, again, it's not complete, that radical transformation is possible. That police states and oppressive regimes that have been there for decades can be brought down, that they can be transformed. And we would like to see something similar happen to the apartheid regime in Israel, that may be possible. I won't say more about that now, but yes, I think they'll have an important impact. The other questions. Alex asked about upgrading Palestinian missions around the world. This is where countries like the UK and France and US have said that the PLO office in their capital now has, the status of an embassy or some undefined upgraded status. And this is supposed to indicate some advance for the Palestinian cause. This is a complete red herring, and nobody should take this bait. This is, the Europeans and others, and some Latin American states have been doing this, but I think the culpability lies more in Europe and the United States, where having failed to live up to their promises to bring about a Palestinian state. They think that they can pretend there's a Palestinian state, and we won't notice that it's really a South African-style Bantustan. So don't fall for that. The third question about who should we be engaging with the BDS campaign and anti-apartheid campaign. Should there be a focus on the general public? What about British jury? I think we should be trying to engage everyone. But not everyone will be engaged in the same way. So there are vigorous efforts within trade unions, within some churches, on university campuses. There are efforts to engage shoppers and, through consumer boycotts, to engage ordinary citizens. There is, of course, organized Jewish support for the boycott, even within Israel. There's a group in Israel called Boycott from Within, which supports boycott. And there are, in the United States, I know less about the UK context, groups like Jewish Voices for Peace that have adopted at least parts of the boycott and who are debating how to go further. Jewish Voices for Peace, for example, has spearheaded a campaign in the United States to get the largest teachers' pension fund in the United States to divest from Israel. So there is no limit. This campaign is open to everybody who agrees with the universal principle it stands for.
I'll stay seated if that's okay. Everyone can hear me. I think Ali has answered those questions pretty comprehensively, but I just say one or two things very quickly. I think irrespective of what's been happening in recent weeks and months in the Middle East and North Africa has been extremely exciting. But irrespective of what happens, I think we need, those of us here in the West who are concerned about human rights and international justice, need to continue to keep a very close eye on what our governments are doing. Just over the past weekend, I was reading quite a bit, particularly about the way that the French have led the bombing of Libya, and you've probably seen the comments that Nicolas Sarkozy, the French president, has made, where he's talking about France assuming its role in history. Yet, the same French government that Nicolas Sarkozy is in charge of has sold a considerable amount of weaponry to Colonel Gaddafi's regime in recent years. Just have a couple of figures. I'll just give you the total figure of French weapons sales to Libya for the year 2009 was over 30 million euros. Interestingly enough, that includes a large consignment of military planes. I think it's hugely ironic that countries that are pushing for a no-fly zone in Libya are the same countries that a couple of years earlier were the ones who were providing Gaddafi's forces with warplanes. And Britain, of course, is in the same boat, particularly with Libya. There was a couple of years ago, the British, I can't remember. I think they're called the British Defence Manufacturers Association, or a trade association group for British arms companies. The same guys that accompanied Cameron on his recent jaunts to Egypt, no doubt. And they described Libya as a relatively sophisticated customer for Britain. Reading between the lines, I think that just means that the Libyans could have their arms twisted to buy everything and anything from Britain. One particular deal I think was worth something like £100 million alone. Memory serves me right. Just with the question of the upgrading of certain by certain European countries of their Palestinian representatives, while this might be interesting from a symbolic point of view, we have to remember that the European Union has been playing a very dangerous game in terms of its relations with the various factions in Palestine. By refusing to deal with Hamas, despite the fact that Hamas won an election in 2006, a parliamentary election in 2006, that the European Union's own advisors deemed to be free and fair, and indeed, in the words of some, to be a model election for the Arab world. In refusing to deal with the victors of that election, Hamas, the European Union has been actively sowing divisions in Palestine. Anybody who knows anything, is studying anything about colonial history, will know that there's an age-old colonial tactic called divide and rule. I think that's what has been happening. That's been the Israeli tactic essentially in Palestine, and Europe and the United States has been assisting with that tactic. Just quickly with regard to what our friend here said about public opinion and so on, there's just like to point to what to the words of a former MP with the Labour Party called Lorna Fitzsimons, who's very active in the Labour Friends of Israel when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were in office, and now runs an outfit called BICOM. I think it's British Israel Communications and Research Centre. Last year at the Herzliya conference, which is one of the main events on the Israeli political calendar, she said that foreign policy in Britain is an elite issue, that it doesn't and public opinion has no bearing on foreign policy in Britain. If that's the case, then what we need is a people's foreign policy. Everything has to be done to change that. To change that, no government can completely ignore public opinion. Even in appalling democracies, they have to take account of public opinion. So this is despite the fact that she might be describing a reality to a certain degree, it's not something that has to remain reality forever.
Good. Thank you very much. So I have a confession to make. I don't know how long we've got the room for. Does anybody?
Till 8 o'clock.
Okay, so we've certainly got time for some more questions, because I think it's just 22. So yeah.
I was going to ask, from within Palestine itself and within the Palestinian territories, there was, and within the diaspora, there was many calls from Palestinian youth calling under the banner of unity, but one of the main clauses was elections to the PNC, which was the council for the PLO, which is deemed to be the sole representative of the Palestinian people. And they're calling for elections to include all Palestinians, both Palestinians in refugee camps and also in the diaspora, so they may finally be represented. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were about this, and whether you think it is a progressive or a sign of progress at all.
Yes.
So I wonder if I could make just a couple of brief observations, which nevertheless the speakers might like to comment on it. And first is taking up David's point about the European definition of I think it's called the EUMC definition. And this is a committee that no longer exists, I understand. And it's never been ratified, that definition, by the European Union, but nevertheless it remains on their website, and it does look as if the European Union is telling us that criticises Israel as racist. The only country in the world that makes such a claim. Now, this does impact, and it impacts in a way on everybody in this room, apart from maybe myself and one or two others who are not students anymore, because the National Union of Students has adopted this bogus definition, and every one of you are going to be constrained by it in the future. Because if we criticise Israel in this room, I suppose, under the NUS rules, then we're all racist, each and every one of us. So that's something that you should watch out for, because it's encroaching and it's in your lives now. And as students, you should do something about that. I hope that, because I don't think the NUS whole membership is generally aware of it. The other thing I'd like to just throw out, and the speakers might comment on, is the interesting point that they raised about the Jewish National Fund. Because I don't think people in England are too aware of this either. The Jewish National Fund is registered here as a charity. So I think they get 30% of the tax money back. So your tax money, but that because it's raised a charity, is being spent on buying land in Israel, which is sold, which is not sold because it remains in property of the JNC, but it can never be given to Arabs because it's for Jews only. It's a completely racist policy, and yet it's endorsed by Gordon Brown, it's endorsed by Tony Blair, and it's endorsed by David Cameron, all three, knowing that this is a racist policy, nevertheless endorsed the acts of the Jewish National Fund. Now we managed to spike it in terms of Miliband because we got a letter in the Guardian the day he became leader of the opposition saying that you'll be asked to join the Jewish National Fund, and we set out what the Jewish National Fund was. And as far as I know, he's in a very uncomfortable position, and I don't know if he's actually gone on to sponsor it, but I mean, people should be aware about it. Later on this month, a campaign will be launched on Land Day to do something about the fact that this monstrous organisation has charitable status in this country, so do watch out for that. That'll be launched on the 30th of this month. And if you want to find out more about it, and it's worth investigating, it's an intriguing situation, go on SPSC, Scottish PSC website, and there's an e-book there about the whole of the Jewish National Fund, because it's actually a scandal that this is allowed to go on. That's all I wanted to say, and if the speakers would want to comment on that, that'd be fine.
Thank you very much. I'll take one more moment.
I just want to make a mention about opportunities to think global and local in terms of BDS, which obviously has been mentioned several times today. Obviously, alongside the aforementioned Veolia campaign, dealing with on the PSC website, we're focused on the issue of the incinerator, which is already a controversial issue in Leeds. We also can focus on the boycott divestment side of that, so please check it out. In terms of the whole BDS movement, we want to get a really good snapshot about where things are to get involved alongside some really excellent activists, theorists from around the country, including Europe. There's a weekend planned with the 1st and 3rd of April up in North Yorkshire. Lovely spot to come, bit of a break, hope we do all work. Anyone here will come along, students will come along at a reduced price, and it's others who go, including yourselves, so really do take advantage of that. So we want you to find out if you can CAFB, Youth Justice, trade unions, churches, students around the country, so please do come and see me afterwards or contact us after the website. And of course also you mentioned Palestine Land Day on the 30th of March, which has been declared an action day by the BDS movement. Contact either of the two groups that here clear that action plan for that day, which obviously will keep the close guard secret what will happen. Hospitality or supermarkets.
Good, thank you very much. So I'll pass over to Ali and David to comment on, I think you've both got a list of those questions and points, so anything you'd like to comment on them.
Okay, I'm sorry I prefer to stand up, I can't think sitting down. The first question regarding Palestinian calls around the world for Palestinian National Council elections. I think this is a reaction to, and a very valid one, the systematic exclusion of the Palestinian people from having any role in determining the future of Palestine under the guise of the so-called peace process. Way back in 1993, when the Oslo Accords were signed, in a sense, 2/3 of the Palestinian people were excluded from that, being the Palestinians who live in the diaspora, the refugees, and the Palestinian question was limited, in a sense, to the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which is only a small part of it. The BDS call, which I mentioned earlier, the Palestinian Civil Society call, returns to all the three components of the Palestinian question. End of the occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, equal rights for Palestinian citizens of Israel, and rights of refugees. And that means all those Palestinians have to be represented. Even the Palestinian Authority elections in 2006 that the European Union and the United States refused to recognize and worked hard to undermine and to overthrow, the only Palestinians who had a chance to vote were those in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Now, a generation or two ago, there was something called the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was recognized by Palestinians broadly as representing them, representing Palestinians throughout the world. That organization is now moribund. It still exists on paper, but it doesn't represent Palestinians. It's been usurped by people who have absolutely no mandate from any Palestinians except themselves. And so it's very legitimate for Palestinians to say, we want to have a role. The difficulties are there is no mechanism to do this right now. The call for elections to the Palestine National Council, the so-called Parliament in Exile, if those elections happened, it would be the first time ever, because although the Palestine National Council had legitimacy, it was never directly elected because of the difficulties of electing, of Palestinians holding an election, across this vast diaspora. Technically, it might be possible today. We've seen, for example, in the case of the Iraq and Afghanistan elections organized by the occupying powers in those countries, that they were able to hold out-of-country voting for Iraqis around the world, for Afghans around the world. So in theory, technically, you could hold elections for Palestinians around the world. The thing that makes me slightly queasy is that if Palestinians couldn't really control and monitor these elections, I would worry that the same sorts of countries that undermined the elections in the West Bank and Gaza Strip would go to work on those as well, because they've never really supported Palestinians choosing their own leaders and determining their own future. So it's problematic, but it does represent, I think, a needed and timely reawakening of Palestinians in the diaspora and inside Palestine to say, we need to be able to represent ourselves and determine our own future, and not have these people who we haven't chosen, but who've been chosen for us by the European Union and the United States, that we want to make our own choices. I won't say anything about the other things. Those are very useful comments, but in the interest of time, I will allow them to stand as they were given.
I just answered the question about anti-Semitism, the definition of anti-Semitism, if I may. You're absolutely right. The body that came up with this working definition was called the European Union Monitoring Centre for Racism, Monitoring Centre Against Racism and Xenophobia. It's based in Vienna. It's subsequently been renamed the Fundamental Rights Agency, and the woman who's in charge of the agency when this definition was drawn up, her name was Beate Winkler, and she described it as a work in progress. It was never actually formally endorsed by that agency or by other European Union institutions, but it's become kind of the de facto definition of anti-Semitism, and it gives examples of what can be considered anti-Semitism. It says essentially, among the examples it cites are that if you describe the establishment of the State of Israel as a racist endeavour, or if you make any comparisons whatsoever between the Israelis or tactics used by the Israelis and tactics used by the Nazis, then you can be accused of anti-Semitism. So effectively it conflates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, which are completely two different things. People are opposed to Zionism and the racist, the fact that Zionism is essentially quite a new ideology. It dates basically from the late 19th century, really, from Theodor Herzl's writings in particular, whereas Judaism is a religion that dates back from over a number of millennia. They're two distinct things. It's perfectly possible to be anti-Zionist and to be and not to have anything whatsoever against ordinary Jews. Indeed, some of the most eloquent anti-Zionists in the world are Jews. But what I was just going to say tiny bit sidetrack there. What I was going to say is that despite the fact that this definition has never been formally adopted, this same outfit, the Fundamental Rights Agency, every so often publishes documents which claim to give a snapshot of anti-Semitic attitudes in the European Union. But if you read through those documents, I've had the misfortune of ploughing through a couple of them myself, and they're quite shoddy, to be perfectly honest. They're not really, by any stretch of the imagination, could they be described as serious publications. Instead, what they are is essentially cut and paste jobs. They take studies, conclusions from highly partisan groups such as the Anti-Defamation League in the United States, which is part of B'nai B'rith International, and there's quite a good film. I might necessarily agree with all of it, but there's quite a good film that you can find on the internet called Defamation, which exposes how the Anti-Defamation League in America has been trying to find evidence of anti-Semitism where there's none. It's been essentially inventing cock and bull stories of anti-Semitism. So it's a highly suspect organisation. In no way should its findings be taken seriously. Yet it's treated as if what it says is treated almost as gospel. I don't know if that's the right term, by the Fundamental Rights Agency, an official European Union body in Vienna. Just finally, there's maybe refer you to quite a good article that was written recently. It's available on a website called J News. It's written by a guy called Richard Cooper, who was a former director of Jews for Justice for Palestinians here in Britain, and Richard Cooper argues that the EU's de facto definition of anti-Semitism has nothing to do with genuinely fighting anti-Semitism, and instead has a lot to do with trying to muzzle critics of Israel.